We continue with the reaction to the International Court of Justice ruling ordering Israel to take measures to prevent acts of genocide against Palestinians. I'm joined by Thomas MacManus, Senior Lecturer at State Crime, Queen Mary University of London School of Law. Thomas, appreciate your time this evening. Now, how do you assess the legal implications of the International Court of Justice ruling on Israel's actions in Gaza?
Well, any ruling of the International Court of Justice is, of course, binding. But that's a different matter to have those measurements enforced, and that's where probably we're going to run into some legal and more likely political problems. But a really powerful statement from the court asking Israel to desist what they're doing, to stop killing people with the view to wiping out the group. And this really puts the whole world now on notice that there's a serious risk of genocide. If the International Court of Justice says that they reckon there's a plausible case, then the genocide treaty obligations kick in, and all states now must look at this matter.
Now, from your own perspective, is there genocide occurring in Israel? I mean, if you look at the two definitions of what genocide is in Palestine, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that it is. We have a pattern going back some years now of stigmatizing and dehumanizing the Palestinian people. We have harassment and persecution from the authorities. We have people isolated in what is really a very large ghetto in Gaza. And now what we're seeing is kind of the next stage of genocide, after the people are systematically weakened, that they are directly attacked and killed. So from our understanding of genocides in the past, this is following a very clear pattern now. The law is, of course, quite difficult. It's quite difficult to prosecute someone for genocide because of the level of intent you have to show. But it's quite clear to most of the genocide scholars that I'm in contact with that we are looking at a genocidal process occurring in Gaza and in the West Bank, and we've been looking at it for some time now.
Thomas, it's interesting that you raise that you've been looking at these issues for some time, and that it's not just now or not since October 7th last year when this started. So where's the law been the last few years that all of this has been happening?
Well, we've seen the UN Security Council tabling resolutions, but they've been vetoed by states protecting Israel. We've seen the UN General Assembly issuing resolutions as well. They're not binding, of course, but the UN Security Council ones are, and some have gone through the UN Security Council, but they've just been ignored. And what it's doing is kind of exposing a flaw in international law in that those states with permanent membership of the UN Security Council really control what is enforced and what isn't. So the law takes a long time to catch up, but the International Court of Justice now has been asked for the first time to look at it, and they've said, yes, there is a plausible case to be answered here, that they're looking at their own UN agencies' assessment of the situation on the ground, matching that up with the statements and pronouncements that have been made by the Israeli government. And when you put those two things together, the law is now catching up to this realization that we are dealing with genocide.
So as things stand, Israel is potentially on genocide watch, if there's anything called that. Is the long arm of the law going to look at the period before this transpired, certainly, to assess Israel's intents prior to this, or are they working specifically with this period in question?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I would like to see what happens when we get to the merit stage of this case. It's going to be some years before we get to that stage. And based on the South Africa's case that was filed for these preliminary measures, they went back as far as 1947 in that submission to show that this is not an isolated attack on the Palestinian people, that we've been looking at a slow-moving, bubbling genocide over the years. So I think that to put together a good case, South Africa is going to bring in the historical context, because that's the only way in which we can understand what's happening, I think. Genocide is often understood to be just, a spectacularized event of mass killing, but it doesn't really work like that. It's a long process sometimes, and I think a good case would look at the history, and I would fully expect South Africa to do that.
Now, Thomas, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reacted obviously to that ICJ ruling, and he said Israel will continue to defend itself, and in fact he said Israel will continue to defend ourselves and our citizens while adhering to international law, I quote. How do you interpret this response in the context of today's ruling from the ICJ?
Well, I think we have to take into account Benjamin Netanyahu's statements before the court even ruled. He said The Hague is not going to stop us, which was a kind of a rather foolish statement in the light of not having heard what the court was going to say yet. So we're already aware that Israel have a tendency to ignore international law and a tendency to ignore resolutions and court rulings. So to say that we're going to follow international law and at the same time continue on regardless doesn't really fit. There's a disconnect there. One of those two things has to go. They have to either follow the judgment and stop what they're doing, stop the killing, and reestablish health care and let humanitarian aid in, or they can continue as they're doing, which would not be following international law. So there's definitely a disconnect there, and it's going to be interesting to see what changes are made to Israel's policies and practices on the ground on the basis of this ruling.
Thomas, let's look at Israel's allies, and one of those allies, in fact, I think their biggest ally is the United States. And the United States was in support of Israel defending itself. But it somehow changed tone over the last few weeks, encouraging Israel to be less aggressive, for want of a better description. But Israel doesn't seem to be listening to the United States or anybody for that matter. What's likely to happen in that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we're not privy to the internal conversations they have. We know that President Biden has been frustrated and potentially angered by Israel's reaction to his recommendations to tone down what they're doing. So we know that the relationship is frayed, but it's an extremely strong relationship. That the amount of aid and military support and weapons that the U.S. provides to Israel is ongoing for a long time now. So the relationship is solid, but it has been frayed, and in fact it's going to be put under severe pressure by this ruling, because if the U.S. continue to support, then they're open to cases against them for enabling genocide, but also failing to prevent genocide. So this is going to put a lot of pressure on their relationship, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Now, how much of that pressure to the United States is internal pressure? Because from polls, certainly a huge number of Americans are against war. They're against President Biden supporting Israel.
Yeah, we're hearing of huge resistance against the American policy on this, especially in the Democratic camp. And President Biden is going to be thinking about elections, of course, coming up. So he's going to have to look very carefully at his demographic and make decisions about which side they're going to come down on. So how are they going to keep both? I understand it's 50-50 in their supporters. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they tread this line between advocating Palestinian rights and protecting them, while at the same time supporting Israel. And probably the only way to do that is for Biden to get through to Netanyahu and to get him to follow his demands to stop doing what they're doing, at least stop doing it on the scale of which they're doing it. So it's going to be a very fine line, and an election year is going to play into that, of course.
Now, the United States is expected as unrelenting, and reports suggest that CIA Director William Burns is meeting with the Israeli officials to discuss a potential ceasefire. What role could intelligence agencies play in brokering or when influencing such agreements?
Yeah, I mean, they're trying everything, I suppose. They have the president calling, and now they're going to try and get other, not quite back channels, but other channels of diplomacy. And, you know, their intelligence agencies work quite closely together, so maybe it'll carry more weight coming from that instead of a political head of state kind of approach. Maybe they'll have more respect for intelligence agencies, but it's hard to say. I think the Americans are going to have to try all routes now to try and get through to Israel that on the back of this case they're losing the fight in the court of world opinion, definitely, and they're also losing it in the International Court of Justice.
Well, let's talk about the opinions in the UK where you are. What are those opinions? What is the UK government stance?
The UK's government stance is to staunchly support Israel. And whether that is just a nod to their American colleagues or otherwise, it's very difficult to say. There's a very strong resistance on the ground from civil society. We've seen very large marches, and we're seeing campaigns and organizations of people who are very uncomfortable with the way that the UK is supporting Israel. And so it's going to be interesting to see, again, on the back of this judgment, the UK government could come up under even more pressure than the US government has come under because of the way the system works here and the kinds of things that people can do with judicial review and inquiries. So I'm very curious to see if the UK will move off its very staunch support of Israel that it's currently portraying, including from the opposition party. Which is, frankly, unexplainable at the moment, but it's to do with elections that we're expecting here over the next few months, I would say.
Now, Thomas, the one thing that we've seen is an attempt by certain countries, or at least citizens of certain countries, to abandon purchase of Israeli products. So call them economic sanctions of sorts, if you will. Is this likely to give any pressure to Israel? Is this an option to get to some form of resolution or get them to stand up and listen?
Yeah, I think it must be, right? We know from history, and you'll know more than I do about this, we know from history that these kinds of sanctions and BDS campaigns can be very effective. And this case actually is going to feed into this a lot, because now we can go to, local authorities or pension plans or even universities who partner with Israeli universities and Israeli weapons companies and say, well, before today, we were, it was all up in the air and opinions about whether there was a possible genocide going on. But now we have a determination. We have the International Court of Justice saying that it's plausible on the face of it that we're looking at genocide. So there's all kinds of wedges and pressure points now that can be put on a whole range of actors, from corporations to states to local authorities, where they're going to have to sit up and say, well, actually, we need to take this into account. And the pressure that civil society has been put on them has been given a new tool to say, well, it's not just us, surmising that there might be genocide. The International Court of Justice agrees with this. So now what are you going to do to abide by your own ethical policies?
So finally, in light of the ruling, how does the role of Hamas in the conflict factor into the legal and diplomatic discussions? And what challenges does it present for reaching a resolution?
Well, Hamas is, as it is not a state, it is not subject to orders by the court. And so that is problematic in itself, of course. So any calls from ceasefire from the court wouldn't have really made any sense, because they could only ask one side to lay down their arms, and that isn't really within the purview of a genocide case. So, but based on the back of the ruling, Israel is going to have to stop doing what it's doing, and that puts a lot of pressure on them to enter negotiations with renewed fervor, I would say. And it will give other states a platform on which to pressure Israel into negotiations. And so I think it should open the ground for possible ceasefire negotiations upcoming. But Hamas is, as it's not a state, as it's a non-state actor as such, the International Court can't really tell it what to do. But the pressure it's put on Israel means that they're going to have to be engaged with, I think.
Thomas, thanks so much for speaking to us. That was Thomas MacManus, a senior lecturer in state crime at Queen Mary University of London School of Law.